Hello, everyone. Welcome to this expert seminar. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Hi, Jonathan. How are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Happy to talk to
Might have to
you.
step out for a few seconds. I have a guy fixing my washing machine here.
Okay, well, that's, of course, of
We'd like to
strategic
switch clothes.
interest. Yes, that's right. Okay. Well, let's wait a few more minutes to give everyone a chance to connect. I hope you're all doing well.
עמית, אתה יכול להביא לי גם...
Marleen, kom eens.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I think we can start because I believe the people for the first three panels are all present. So welcome to you all. Let's see. Let me get organized here. Yeah. Okay, can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay, I believe so. Yes, perfect. Okay. Well, welcome to the expert seminar on the impact of religious freedom research. And it's so good to see so many people I know, very good friends, and also people that will probably become good friends after this seminar. And I see you're here from all over the world. I'm speaking from Costa Rica myself, so I'm having my morning tea while some of you may already be enjoying their afternoon whiskey. I don't know. But I'm very pleased to welcome all of you, all colleagues and other participants. And thank you all very much for being here and for preparing your papers or presentations. I know this has been a challenge for some of you, including myself, because of the adjustments we had to make due to the Corona crisis. But here we are, so I'm very pleased. And our host today would have been the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, but due to Corona, we're having a virtual meeting. But the advantage is that most of us are here. The disadvantage is, of course, that we miss the social interaction. But I think the good thing is that actually more people were able to join and participate thanks to this being a virtual seminar. So that's, I think, something positive. And just to remind all of you, the starting point for this expert seminar is the growing interest in religious freedom in both academia and also in the policy-making world. And what we're interested in understanding and in researching is, well, what has the impact been of all these efforts that both academics and policymakers have made to study and promote religious freedom. So through the seminar, we're gathering outstanding scholars of religious freedom and discuss the impact of religious freedom research in three domains. On academia itself, it's always important to be self-reflective, on policy, and also on vulnerable religious groups themselves. To what extent does our research help them? And we want to establish a bridge between academia and policymakers. So make sure our research gets applied and that the societal relevance of our work is as high as possible. And also as a general reminder for those who are not familiar with this seminar, the papers produced as part of this expert seminar will be published as part of a special issue of the International Journal for Religious Freedom. I just would like to ask Janet at Buckingham and then Govert Buys to please give a word of welcome. So Janet at Buckingham is the managing editor of the International Journal of Religious Freedom. And Govert Buys is professor of philosophy at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and he will be guest editor together with myself of this special issue. So Janet, please, are you there?
I was here but muted there. So first of all, welcome to all of you from around the world. So glad to be with you all this morning. It's wonderful to see this expert seminar finally come together, and a huge thank you to Dennis for his vision and for organizing it, and for all of us being able to get papers in and change our plans to be able to do this online. The journal has been running for quite a number of years. It was dormant for a period of time, and it is now coming roaring back. And that's partly due to people having a vision for special issues and thematic issues. So I think this will be very valuable and helpful, and I look forward to all of everyone's contributions today.
Thank you, Janet. Govert.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you as well, Dennis. And on behalf, I think, of the Vrije Universiteit, who would have be the host university of this seminar, would it have been an offline seminar, then of course I would have welcomed you too. So I'm glad that I can have this opportunity now as well to extend a warm welcome to all of you. Yeah, thanks for all the effort that you are putting in. And yeah, the real the reason why this seminar is organized is basically because Dennis has been working on these themes already for quite some time as a human rights activist, and especially concerned with religious freedom. And he has written a beautiful dissertation on this. I will just show you this. I don't know whether it works. It looks beautiful from the outside, but it's very interesting from the inside too. So, and he will defend this dissertation next week, Friday, actually, which will be as well an online defense, so which is entirely new for me and I think for all of us. But basically connected to that, the idea he came up with, the idea, wouldn't it be good to have a further reflection on, you can say, on the impact of religious freedom research? And he contacted then the editors of the Journal for Religious Freedom and said, well, couldn't we work on a special issue on these questions? So actually, that is why we are here. So thank you, Dennis, very much for your initiative in this respect. And well, I already wish you very well with your defense next week. But already as a kind of preparation for this, we have this event. And well, looking from what we have been offered now, I think this is going to be a very interesting issue. So I think you have been, your intuition has been very accurate to say that there's a lot of interesting material here that we really should bring out in the open and discuss. So well, thank you. And yeah, I think Dennis, you are going to chair the first half of the afternoon, and I will do the second half. So yeah, it may be good as well to have some time, kind of a short break in between. And we discussed as well that we will just have to see how far we get. It may be that it goes quite fast. Perhaps we need to have a second session. We're just going to see how things are developing. So in that sense, the format is open. It is new in that sense that we are doing it in this way. So we just have to experiment a little bit as well. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Govert. Yes, you're right. And Janet as well, thank you very much. I just want to give you a few practical points very quickly before we start. So just so all of you are aware, this session is recorded and open to the public. I think it's important you're aware of this. And yes, we are trying to adapt this to a virtual setting. And so we're making some changes to normal academic panel discussions. We understand that it can be somewhat exhausting, so we understand this. But here are a few practical points. First of all, if you're comfortable, I would like to ask you to all please turn your camera on, so we know who's in the room. Also please turn your microphones off when you're not talking, because that will make it easier for us to listen to the people, to the person who is talking. As we said, for each paper that we will be discussing, we'll be discussing a total of 14 papers this afternoon, if we get there. So we'll give the author or the team of authors of each paper 7 minutes to present. Then the discussant that was assigned to them will get 3 minutes to present some critical points on the paper, and then there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Now, all participants are welcome to ask questions, but please send me a chat message through the chat function on Zoom if you want to ask a question, which is the equivalent of raising your hand in a normal setting. And before you start talking, please mention your name and your affiliation, whether that's the university you work for or the organization you work for. Now, we have a very tight schedule, but as Govert said, we don't want to rush things. So we'll probably take a 10-minute break halfway at about 15:30. And then at 16:30, we will decide collectively if we will need a follow-up session next week or not, because our aim is to finish today at 17 Amsterdam time. Of course, I'm talking from Costa Rica. I'm in a different time zone. It's still early in the morning here, but all the times are Amsterdam time. And also for the authors, this is important for you to know. This session is part of open peer review process. And we will likely combine this with at least one blind peer reviewer, but I'll discuss this with the editors of the journal, and instructions will follow by email later. But thank you all again for being here, and let's start with our first presentation. Jonathan Fox, who by the way is also supervisor of my PhD dissertation, a long personal friend. How common is religious freedom worldwide? Jonathan, we look forward to listening to you.
Hi, how are you doing? Just give me a second. I actually prepared a PowerPoint, so I'm going to shoot that up to the screen. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. I have 13 slides, but I believe I can get through them in 7 minutes. I'm just going to discuss how common is religious freedom worldwide. I have a nice lit review in the paper, but we're going to skip most of that and talk more about the practical results. You want to hear about the theory, I'm happy to discuss the theory. But basically, I've identified 4 types of restrictions on religious freedom, which I'm able to measure using my religion and state data set. Normally, I talk a little bit about the data set, but with only 7 minutes, I'll assume some of you are familiar with it. Some of you are not. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions on it. But we can break things up into 4 types of restrictions you might find worldwide on religious freedom. The first is restricting the religious practices or institutions of religious minorities in a manner that the majority is not restricted. I call this my discrimination variable because to discriminate means to treat differently. When governments are restricting only minorities in a way they're not restricting the majority, that means different things, at least as far as motivations, than if they're restricting everybody. The next variable is regulation of all religion, including the majority religion. The third one is laws or institutions which enforce religion. If you are enforcing religion, that violates the freedom not to be religious if you choose to, which is part of the freedom of religion. And it also might violate the religious freedom of those not belonging to the religion enforced, and other types of support for religion. You wouldn't think supporting religion would violate religious freedom, but there are some conceptions of religious freedom that consider that. So now I'm going to be discussing several conceptions of religious freedom because people do not agree on what religious freedom means. And this is by no means all of them, but it's a good survey of the types that are out there and the more popular types, at least as far as government policy. The first one is the free exercise of religion. That's pretty much a quote from the free exercise is a quote from the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution promises that Congress shall pass no law restricting the free exercise of religion. And this basically means the government may not limit religious practices or institutions for anybody. And here we have our 4 questions, whether or not the government is restricting the engaging in these 4, whether or not any of these practices would violate the freedom of religion according to this particular version. Certainly restricting the religious practices or the minority or the majority would restrict it. Laws which enforce religion would only violate this if observing the laws violates one's religion or one's willingness or one's desire not to be religious. Other types of support for religion are not a problem. The second one is religious persecution or repression, which Jenkins defines as an effort by the government to repress major activities by a given religious group. This certainly would not, you certainly would not be allowed to restrict religious practices either for the majority or the minority. Laws which enforce religion would probably violate this because it could repress religious activities, but again, no problem with support. Religious toleration, I have a few definitions for this on the screen, but I like the one of putting up with those you dislike or with those with whom you disagree. This functionally is very similar to repression because you're certainly not allowed to restrict religious practices or institutions. The laws or institutions which enforce religion, whether or not this is relevant depends on how you want to interpret the standard. There's some debate on this, but again, no issue with supporting, say, the majority religion. Absolute separationism. This is actually the US model. The government may not become involved in religion in any way. Well, all 4 things we looked at would violate that, including supporting religion. This is actually a bit broader than religious freedom. This is a framework for government-religion relations, which certainly has implications for religious freedom, as is neutrality or a level playing field. The government may not prefer or disadvantage any religion, or no religion may be allowed to have any competitive advantage over others. Roger Finke is the one who likes to use the level playing field idea. Now, this is actually a little bit interesting because you can restrict religion if you're doing it to everybody equally. If freedom means everybody's treated equally, then you can actually support or you can restrict religion as long as you do it equally for all religions. The final one is laicism or secularism. The laicism comes from the French model. The government may not support religion, and religion is inappropriate in the public sphere. So you certainly could not restrict religious minorities in a way you don't restrict the majority, but you can restrict everybody, and in fact, you're sort of expected to under this version of religious freedom. We're free because religion is private. It is not influencing the public, and this makes religion free. You certainly cannot have laws or institutions which enforce religion, and you certainly cannot support religion under this standard. Now, I operationalize all these standards. Again, you're going to have to take my word for it that I have a scale for each one of these models, which goes from 0 to some relatively high number, depending on the scale. And I created 3 standards for each one. The first is zero tolerance, meaning even if you score a 1, anything above a 0 is a violation. And since all of these standards usually involve multiple variables, if you're above 0 on any one of them, that would be the zero tolerance. The lenient standard goes on the argument, well, perhaps a country follows, for the most part, one of these standards, but there are a few imperfections in their policy. So, and the very lenient standard allows a lot more imperfection. If you're scoring a 5, you might have 5 on any one variable. You might have 5 different ways the government is restricting majority religions in some minor way, or 2 where they're doing it in a very significant way. So this is an incredibly lenient standard. Now you'll notice, based on free exercise, I looked at all countries, and I just wanted to demonstrate this is something that happened. Even democracies do not have a lot of religious freedom. This is the percentage of countries which meet that standard. If you look at zero tolerance, almost no countries, whether Western democracies, polity equals 10 or polity 8 or higher. Polity is a well-known data set for democracy, which runs from -10, the most autocratic, to 10, the most democratic. So democracies really have patterns similar to all countries. Most countries in the world do not have anything resembling free exercise, and this includes democracies. You want to look at avoiding religious persecution. The results are basically similar. If you look among democracies as polity equals 10 and get it very lenient, we're up to 43%. But again, this is a very loose standard. If you go zero tolerance, no country meets this standard, not a single country in the world. And my data set includes currently 183 countries. This is the results for 2014, which is the most recent year I currently have. And this is pretty much every country in the world with at least 250,000 people living in it, and a few smaller countries. None of them have it based on that. Same thing with the absolute separationism. This is even less common. Very few of them even meet the lenient standard, and may a little bit under 80% of the countries in the world, do not even meet the very lenient standard. Neutrality gets a little better. You have a few countries, a few democracies that meet this standard. But again, and if you look at all countries and use the very lenient standard, we get to about half the countries in the world, a little bit more. But almost half don't have it based on this very lenient standard. Laicism goes back down. We don't have so many countries that have it. No one, including France, that allegedly has this policy at the zero tolerance level. Very few countries have it at the lenient, not so many at the very lenient standard. So basically, that's it for the PowerPoint version. But I'd like to say this has some serious implications for when we're discussing religious freedom, we're discussing it a lot in theory, but I would submit most countries do not have it. So, and this is some very interesting things about liberal democracy, which supposedly have religious freedom and believe in it, yet most of them do not in fact have it. So I would submit that many liberal democracies are not liberal democracies in this respect, or religious freedom is not really a central value or very important for liberal democracy based on my results. I think I kept it down to 7 minutes.
Yeah, 7 minutes that lasted for 10 minutes, but it was worth it. Thank you very much, Jonathan. That's all right. This was important. Govert, please, you're the discussant for Jonathan's paper.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to see your face. Actually, we have been quite a few in mail contact, of course, but that's great. Well, thank you for your paper as well, which is very rich and very interesting. Yeah, let's just go to a couple of questions that I have. Apart from that, it is yeah, as I say, it is really worthwhile, and in a way, if you go along with your type of argument, it may be even shocking, but it may be that I have some questions about it, that it may be as well dependent on the framework that you are proposing here. So let me just ask a couple of questions. I was wondering, when I read through your results, well, results sometimes can be very counterintuitive, and sometimes then you have to reconsider, say, well, my intuitions. So I have the intuition that there is a real big difference between, say, in religious freedom, between, say, North Korea and the United States. And if out of your research comes that the difference doesn't bear out, then there is a problem somehow. And I would say, well, perhaps then the framework is not fully adequate to what it wants to achieve. And so I was wondering, is regulation always repression? Let's, for example, if there is a law on religions, and religions are given by that law, for example, a legal personality, a religious community, yes, and they are regulated, they can apply for having legal personality, and then they can, hire personnel, etc. That is regulating religion. Is that repressing religion? Or is it enabling religion, yes? Isn't a lot of regulation is maybe as well enabling? The assumption underneath your research seems to be that, you could say every government regulation seems to be always immediately a threat to religious freedom. And I wonder whether there is a difference between repressing regulation and enabling regulation, yes? That comes up with a second point, that if you use so many interpretations and standards, definitions of religious freedom at the same time, of which you yourself say that they may be conflicting, in the sense that you say, well, it is impossible, you say on page 4, for each country to have the same, to apply to all the 6 at the same time. And then later on you apply them all 6 to all countries. So I was wondering there, is it really that you can, is it really possible to have, to use in one paper, so to say, 6 different definitions of religious freedom, and apply them at the same time all? And then, so yeah, that's my second question, I think. And the third question, just to keep it brief, is that does not refer to your presentation but to your paper itself. That's the list of standards that are used on page 7 and 8. I can see that a lot of these measures that you are there, 26, and later on another type of 26, that a lot of them are related to religion, but they don't have to be related to religion. Say restrictions on premarital sex, for example. Often they are related to religion, but they don't have to be related to religion. So there can as well be culture, but more cultural elements, which in a sense sometimes may have some quite, difficult relationship with religion as such. So may not be one-on-one, have an absolute connection, the one to the with religion always. So I think that are my 3 main questions. But I think in general, I think it is very impressive research. So it is a very interesting paper. So thank you for that.
Jonathan, before you respond, Robert, thank you for your questions. There's one more question from the audience. I think we can take that question right away and then give Jonathan the opportunity to respond. Jim Wallace, please.
Yes, thanks. I really enjoyed this paper very much. My question came on your conceptions. You talked about free exercise being from the U.S. Constitution, First Amendment, yes. Then you said absolute separation was what U.S. government used. But then under the issue of neutrality, you have the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on Lemon v. Kurtzman, the Lemon test. And so really, depending on how it's applied, you could argue that 3 of those conceptions apply to the US. How do you handle in your data set and in your analysis, working where different models can apply in different ways or by different branches of government to your data?
Jonathan, your response.
Okay, I'm going in order. North Korea on my variables scores way higher than the US on all of them. Interestingly enough, including supporting religion, which sort of gets into your second question, where the relationship is very, but I'll get to that in a sec. I set minimum standards. Now, I'm arguing most countries violate these standards. Certainly there are countries that violate these standards far more flagrantly than others. And actually the data set was not really designed to measure religious freedom. It was designed to measure government religion policy. And it's a series of variables that either the government's doing something or it's not doing something. These are factual questions. And I adopted these measures to look at religious freedom. So the data set was never created to look at religious freedom in particular. It was to look at government religion policy. And based on this, we could certainly construct a way to ask whether the government is meeting the standard of religious freedom, which is what I did here. So the purpose of the variables are a bit different. And there are countries on one end of the scale, and there are countries on the other end of the scale, and every single one of these variables that I use, which I think covers. So North Korea certainly would score higher on a lot of the variables than the US. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's significantly higher. And repressing versus enabling religion is actually a very interesting question. I have a chapter in one of my books where I get into that. That's in my political secularism religion in my political secularism religion, the state book, where one of the interesting things that I discuss, and I'm not the only one to discuss this, is that when governments support religion, they're also controlling religion. Support and control go hand in hand. Say, for example, if you're funding a religion, even if there are no strings attached, if the government wants something from the religious institution, the heads of that institution are going to be afraid if they don't do what the government wants, they might not keep getting their money. So even if control is not intended with the support, the levers of power are there. In many cases, government, China supports religion. North Korea funds religion, and they're doing it for the very express purpose of controlling what's going on in those religious institutions. So it's a very complicated interplay. The reason I use 6 standards for religious freedom is really simple. Nobody agrees on what religious freedom means. So if I'm going to set out to prove not a lot of countries have religious freedom, I have to prove it across multiple standards to make my point. If I don't do that, somebody can say, well, I believe most countries have religious freedom using this standard, which you did not test. So using strict through lenient standards across 6 different definitions, which really run the gamut of the various arguments that are out there, I think was sufficient for making my point. And yes, it is not possible for a country to actually observe all of these standards at the same time, which tells you something about how important this argument over what is religious freedom means. Whichever version you pick has very simplest, and if you want to pick a version of religious freedom to give to your country, which version you pick has very serious implications for what's going to be free and what isn't in practice. So I think it's very important to look at all of these. And as far as items like premarital sex, usually when people make the argument you made, they bring up the abortion one. I get that a lot from Catholics who are claiming this is not religious. When I created this data set, I decided to be inclusive rather than exclusive. It's better to include these items which might or might not be religion, but certainly have something to do with religion. And if somebody, when they're doing their study, doesn't want to include them, it's very easy to pop them out. But if they're not there, no one could include them, and that's why I included them. But I have done some tests on these. If you look at, say, the premarital sex restrictions and the restrictions on abortion, the patterns differ across the religious tradition of the majority, and the more the country is supportive or connected to a religion, the more likely they are to do this. So I would argue they are quite connected, and I have some empirical evidence for this. And as for the US, there's a massive debate going on in the US as to what religious freedom means. For some people, religious freedom means I'm free to discriminate against anybody who doesn't agree with me and to try and force people to observe my religion. That's not a standard I tested in my paper. So the US Constitution has the free exercise clause. You combine it with the establishment clause, you get the absolute separationism. But you have a lot of people in the US, including several Supreme Court justices, that seem to be following more of a neutrality standard. In fact, it's got to be 7, 8 years ago, Alana Kagan, a member of the Supreme Court, one of Obama's appointees, if I'm remembering correctly, was in Israel at a conference on religious freedom. And she said she believed the Supreme Court was moving more away from the absolute standard and more towards a neutrality standard. And since she actually gets one of the 9 votes on the issue, I'm going to say there's probably something to that. I hope that answers your question, James. But again, when you have a debate going on with the society of what religious freedom means, sometimes you're going to have a mixture of elements with different branches of government conceiving of religious freedom differently and trying to enact policy differently. The purpose of this paper was never to explain US policy, it was more to demonstrate worldwide there's a lot more violation of religious freedom going on, particularly in democracies, than people believe. It's a very simple point, but I chose a very complicated way to do it.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Jonathan. I believe there's a couple more questions that other participants want to ask you, but unfortunately we have to move on. So let's go to the second paper now, highlighting dark corners of persecution against Christians, the example of Open Doors World Watch List. Authors are the Dream Team, Thomas Müller, Matthew Rees, and Frans Veerman. I don't know who of you will be giving the presentation, but you have 7 minutes.
I will give the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Can you see me as well? Now you can see me. So,
yes.
Selamat malam from Indonesia. I will very briefly introduce myself. My name is Thomas Müller. I'm persecution analyst for the World Watch research team of Open Doors. I'm responsible for most of the Asian countries. So in our paper, we gave a brief outline of the World Watch List. What is the World Watch List? It started in 1993 as a tool for preparing our work. It was not published. It was just for understanding what is going on in the world. It was an internal planning tool. In 2003, it was published for the first time, and in today's methodology, it is published since 2012. We have a wealth of data and information, and just to give you an idea, or just to give the reader an idea, in the paper, we counted, basically. And in 2020, we present a snapshot of persecution of Christians on round about 2,500 pages. So if you want to know something about a certain country on the World Watch List, you can not just consult the list and see the rank, but you can also see more in detail what is going on in the country reports accompanying the list. We didn't have any space to present how we gather the information. This would fill a whole book, if you like, but all explanations can be found. So we try to give some links for people, for readers who are more interested in getting more information. They can easily find it. Why did we do this? Like many other organizations, and I believe, Dennis, this is what you said in the beginning, other organizations, Open Doors experienced a very strong, growing interest in questions relating to freedom of religion, persecution of Christians, mainly from journalists and politicians, but also beyond that. And it started some 15 years ago, if I see it correct. Before that, it was more seen as a special hobby, like what we call in German an Orchideenfach. I couldn't find a proper English word for it, but it was a special hobby for people who are interested in religion. Okay, so they may be interested in this as well. And now it is becoming much broader. It is seen as a topic for foreign policy, for development, for all kinds of different interests. And this interest has kept on growing in the last 15 years. So while we are talking, it is still growing. We explained this briefly in the article as well. So from the US, Brazil, South Africa to Europe, there are more and more people who want to know. Just one example, the presentation of the World Watch List 2020 was attended by, I think, more than 120 members of parliament in the UK. So this is just, I mean, even 10 years ago, this would have almost been unimaginable. Therefore, we set up a comprehensive questionnaire along the lines of Article 18 and spread a hopefully ever extending network worldwide. The answers enabled us to discover and highlight some of the dark corners of persecution, which we explain and highlight in the article. So the first dark corner are converts, because they are simply bearing the brunt of persecution, not just in the Islamic world, but in basically all countries we are watching. We knew it before. This is why they are a category on their own in our scoring system. Again, we cannot explain it in detail, but it can be found. But we were surprised at the breadth and width of what they endure. So this relates to persecution engines, to the persecutors, or what we call drivers, and to every combination imaginable. So converts are almost always the part of Christianity in that case who are worst off and who have to endure the most persecution. The second group are women. They are often very vulnerable in society in general, of course, because of a prevailing culture. They are disadvantaged in society. Over here it's already evening, so I'm even beyond my afternoon whiskey. So this is maybe because my pronunciation is not super clearly anymore. But as women frequently belong to a minority, and sometimes are even converts, they can become a double or even triple vulnerable group. So they are women, they are converts, and they are also often members of an ethnic minority. So for several reasons, they are very vulnerable. And our article mentions brief examples from our special gender-related persecution report on Nigeria and Myanmar, and explains it in a bit more detail. And finally, this is a third dark corner, which we have named, for lack of a better term for the time being, persecution eclipse. We are still discovering. This means where a general trend in the country, like economic problems or social frictions, darkens underlying religious motivations. For example, this can be seen in Nigeria or the Central African Republic, or even in Myanmar. We are still discovering this phenomenon more, but it is important because it can lead to distorted or incomplete reporting, to incomplete or badly targeted help, because you think it is a social issue or it is an economic issue, whereas in reality, at least it has strong religious components. So it is important to see this persecution eclipse, but we are still shaping this concept, but it is already clearly visible enough to highlight it in such an article. And there may be other corners as well, because this research, it is an annual research, so it is ongoing. and it deserves, it deserves a closer look, like children or migrant workers in the Middle East. And finally, for each and every part, we link it to the experience, how our UK or how our German office are using our research and advocacy efforts, from consulting in individual asylum cases to highlighting the situation of women in EU for a Christian organization, not necessarily open connections. And thus we conclude research is a key topic to open doors, not just to our ministry, but to literally open doors. And the circle closes to the field planning, because now our colleagues in the countries where persecution prevails are discovering this tool again, rediscovering this tool, I have to say. Sorry that I do not turn on my camera all the time, but living in Indonesia, my internet is our internet is a bit shaky, so it is more stable when the camera is turned off. Thank you for bearing with me for 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting, and we're great that you could make it from Indonesia. So thank you. Well, let's go to the discussion. Kareem McDonald, welcome. Look forward to hearing your comments on this paper. And anyone else, if you want to ask a question, please let me know through the chat. Kareem, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that very interesting presentation and article. I think that the work and research that you're doing is very impressive. And I think that in broadening the use of the World Watch List data and reaching out to new partners, these kind of things are absolutely vital to realizing actual solutions and affecting real change in these dark corners of persecution, as you phrase it. I know in my own research on freedom of religion in asylum centers, which includes the situation of Christian converts, I know how difficult it can be, or the barriers that one can encounter in trying to conduct one's research. My question therefore relates to how you deal with, or how you respond to, or how you manage decision makers and authorities as barriers to vital information that is necessary in order to conduct your research, and as barriers to affecting change. For example, what I mean is that in cases where you're denied access to information, and in situations where the authorities or responsible parties refuse to engage or show a lot of resistance to your work. And perhaps also in cases where they do engage, but they're on a completely different page, refusing to recognize the problem that you're researching, or often perhaps displaying a high level of religious illiteracy. And there's some of the things I imagine you encounter in research that the World Watch List conducts, and it's some of the problems that I encounter in my own research. And so I'm curious if you could comment on, in such circumstances, how do you manage these consequences and manage these consequences and the impact that these barriers have on the efficacy of your own research?
Okay, thank you for this question. I think the person who would be even better able to answer it is Franz Fehrmann, who is the manager of the World Watch Research, but I will try to give my best shot, and Franz, if you want to add, of course, you are always welcome to add. So you are right. Information is key, and in this COVID-19 times, we even see it much, much more, because our people, just like everyone else, simply cannot travel in the country anymore, right? So even countries like Laos or all kinds of other countries, they have completely shut down. You are not allowed to go from one district to the next, or from one region to the next. So this is very difficult. Or, as I mentioned Myanmar earlier, one big thing is where you have a warlike situation. I mean, you have a civil war going on in parts of Myanmar. It is very difficult to get feet on the ground, and often you have an information lockdown by the government, but also by insurgents at times. So it is very difficult. We try to extend our network. We are in the lucky position that we are, as an NGO, we are around since 1955. So we were able to build extensive networks in many countries. At the same time, in some countries we started later, so the network is smaller. So this is a challenge. We also try to invite what we call external experts, so people not related to our NGO, but knowledgeable about a country, where we know, okay, they are working for other NGOs, or they are journalists or lawyers or academics dealing with country X. We invite them, and of course their networks. So we really try to cast a broad net. And if all this doesn't help, because a country is very successful in shutting down information, then this works for the benefit of the country. And this is what we state very clearly. I mean, in terms of the list now, if we lack information, this means that the scoring of a country is lower, especially when it comes to violence. If a country manages to keep all information on violence out from the open, then this results in a lower violence score. And this in the end means that the country will most likely end lower on the list. So this is the practical consequence. But of course, we try to get as much information as possible. And this is why we spread a wide network. I don't know, or I don't have the overview because I'm only working for Asia. But there are thousands and thousands of data points each and every year. So we are, at least I can say with some confidence, that we are not missing out big points. We may miss out every now and then, we miss out things which are difficult to measure, sometimes also because they are not related to a country. I mentioned, for example, the migrant workers in the Middle East before. This is a topic which definitely deserves more in-depth research, and we are already working on that. But in terms of the country, what is going on in a country, we managed to get most of it, even in a country like North Korea. The more challenging thing then is that we are not able to disclose all of our sources.
Okay, well, thank you very much. A brief follow-up comment by your co-author Matthew Rees.
Yeah, I just wanted to just to say something quickly on my role at Open Doors is sort of taking the research and trying to use it in order to engage with decision makers. And so I just wanted to pick up on your comment around religious literacy and whether that can be a barrier to some of collecting the research, but actually commenting on how this research can also really help to engage with the issues that we may come across around religious literacy, particularly at the Home Office in the UK. So we often use this research to try and engage with the Home Office around whether Christians generally should be sent back to countries which are on the World Watch list. One of the things that we found very helpful about sort of increasing the spread of this research and the areas in which it looks, be it convert, be it women, is that it actually allows us to speak to very specific issues much more effectively and allows us to really to increase the levels of literacy around a specific case effectively, so that the case isn't just seen as another individual who claims to be a Christian being returned to a country, but allows us to actually speak to the very specific needs of an individual, whether that be a convert being sent to a specific part of Iraq or a specific part of Nigeria, for instance. So I really think actually that the diversification of research to looking at these different areas has really widened our ability to increase religious literacy amongst decision makers in a way that I hadn't noticed until we had been starting to do this and adapt our our evidence to be specifically around the very specific vulnerabilities that Christians who are in fear of being returned face. So I just thought I'd add a perspective from the other side of how the research is then used and the kind of way in which it actually can allow us to break down some of those barriers rather than causing us to face real barriers.
Okay, well, thank you, Matthew. Now, this is a very interesting point about religious literacy. Actually, this whole expert seminar, the whole point of it is also to promote religious literacy in a way. And it's also interesting what came up in the first two presentations, actually. Just making this quick comment that doing religious freedom research is actually more difficult, more challenging right now within because of the coronavirus restrictions. And to some extent, I think you could also argue that the coronavirus restrictions in practice also place restrictions on the exercise of religious freedom, which is interesting, although they may be very much justified. But okay, let's not spend too much time on this now anymore. We need to move forward. I'm really sorry we need to cut this debate short. And I'd like to move to Janet Buckingham's paper, The Use of Documentation in Refugee Determination in Canada. Can we do better? That's a rhetorical question, Janet, I believe.
Definitely, but I want to thank Matthew for having introduced the topic. So that's a very nice segue from the people who are doing the research to how this documentation is used. So I have a legal background, so I was looking for how is documentation used in law. And of course, refugee determination, asylum determination is one of the really key areas where obviously very good documentation is needed. I think it's fair to say that there is a certain amount of suspicion of asylum seekers around the world. There's a certain amount of suspicion of, oh yes, well that's your story, but you're just trying to get from point A to point B. Plus, there is a huge amount of religious illiteracy on the part of the officials that are making determinations about asylum. So refugee determination is a very key area where documentation is being used right now, and of course determining if a claimant is a refugee under the 1951 Convention. So in Canada, we have a tribunal, the Immigration and Refugee Board, which will hold a hearing to determine if a claimant fits the definition of a convention refugee. That is, does the claimant have a legitimate fear of persecution if returned to the country of origin? And a claimant does have the opportunity to introduce evidence of his or her fear of persecution. However, the board makes it clear that the tribunal will rely on what is called the national documentation package in assessing whether that fear of persecution is reasonable. Now, fortunately for the claimant and for all of us who work in this area, the national documentation packages are publicly accessible. They're all right there on a website from the Canadian government. Anyone can access it and see what is included in the package, when it was last updated, and when it is next due for an update. The national documentation packages are all, of course, like there's an outline of them, so you know which sections you need to look at if you're looking particularly for religious freedom issues. And the first section of note is just a general section with country information, but that also includes the religious breakdown for that particular country. Section 2 focuses on human rights generally, and section 12 is the one of key importance because it focuses on religion specifically. So my overall assessment looking at these is that the national documentation packages have the basic reports, but they could be enhanced significantly by including some of the documentation that we're discussing today. Many of the reports and the documentation that people are referencing and data sets that people are using are not referenced in the national documentation packages that have been that are available. So what is there? Well, as you can assume, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees reports are all included in the national documentation packages. The UN Human Rights Council reports, particularly the Universal Periodic Review reports, are included in the human rights section. Usually the UN Special Rapporteur on Religious Freedom reports if there are specific things to that country. You know, if you go to North Korea, you're going to find some good reports from the UN Special Rapporteur on Religious Freedom and also the UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea. There's interestingly a very heavy reliance on US State Department reports. In the general section, the CIA World Fact Book is prominent. First item on every single country is the link to that country's CIA World Fact Book, just for general information and maps. Good references to USCIRF reports and Ambassador for Religious Freedom report on international religious freedom that's prepared for Congress are generally referenced in the religious freedom area. The United Kingdom country of origin reports for UK asylum determination, the ones that are prepared by the Home Office, are often referenced. So there's a little, obviously, from what Matthew said, there's a nice little back door of how things are getting into UK reports that might make it into Canada, because I will say the World Watch reports are not referenced at this point on any of the Canadian country reports. Now, I didn't look at every country, but I looked at several key countries and they were not referenced there. Sometimes there are reports from other countries. I've seen reports from Australia and France, usually from their asylum and refugee determination process. Now, there are key NGO reports that are regularly referenced, and these are Amnesty International. Amnesty International in Canada is considered to be very authoritative. Many Freedom House reports are referenced. Human Rights Watch, the Swiss Refugee Council is often referenced. And occasionally NGOs specific to a particular country like Falun Dafa. But of concern is that I did not find reports specific to situations of Christians to be very well referenced. For example, in China, the most recent documentation was a 2008 article from the Chinese Theological Review. And obviously 2008 is woefully out of date for the situation of Christians in China. So it is possible to recommend a publication for a national documentation package through the website. And I actually did that, have not yet seen any results to see if they will accept my recommendation. I actually recommended the World Watch report. But I think there's definitely room to have more and better documentation on religion in many different parts of the world, but it may take, you know, someone regularly going and updating and recommending reports country by country.
Thank you very much, Janet, for this very interesting overview. And I think we're probably all very disappointed that our own research, our own data sets are not being used as much as they could. But please, I would like to ask Mita Pinto to please give some comments, as she's the discussant for this paper. Are you there? So the discussions we have scheduled are Mital Pinto and Racheli Schulstein. Are you there?
Dennis, do you hear me?
Yes,
There
I
she
do.
is.
Oh, okay, great.
Go ahead.
So,
Go ahead.
okay,
Welcome.
thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. So thank you, Dennis, for inviting me, and thank you, Janet, for letting me comment on your paper. I'm Mital Pinto. I'm from Israel, from Tzfat Academic College. And so I have, I wouldn't call them even comments, mainly questions that were raised while I was hearing your presentation and reading your paper. So you seem to suggest that in some of the instances, NGO reports are conspicuously absent. And so my question is, why do you think that NGO reports should be considered? I mean, what makes them better than other kinds of reports? I mean, what I mean is that NGOs also have certain agendas to push or to counter. So I wouldn't be very I wouldn't hurry to say that their opinion is more trusty than opinions of other bodies. And then the second issue is that I think that maybe what is needed is an accepted definition of religious persecution. I'm not sure that the concept of religious freedom is so relevant here, because I think that what the refugee committees really care about is about religious persecution, and then we have to think whether we are concentrating on religious persecution in terms of physical threats, or do we also want to consider other threats and call them religious persecution, like simple social pressure not to wear certain symbols of religious affiliation. So I would really like to hear more of your thoughts about what it means to be, in your opinion, religiously persecuted. Does it mean that, for instance, let's say, I guess not, but I'm asking anyway, let's say that I'm a group of people who is religious, and I want some subsidy from the state for my religious school. If I don't get it, and other religions do get it, does it mean that this is a religious persecution? How do you, I guess, perceive threats to religious freedom or religious persecution? That's my take.
Thank you, Mital. Very, very interesting question. And also the last one is one I'm personally struggling with quite a lot as well. Okay, so before you respond, there's two other questions lined up by Jim Wallace and then by Frans Veerman. So can you please be brief, and then we'll give Janet the opportunity to respond.
Yes, Janet, I very much enjoyed your paper, particularly because of the connection to Canada. I was surprised when you talked about how the CIA World Factbook was sort of first out of the gate on this because of Canada, US pressures, and how the CIA is viewed in Canada, that they would use that as a source. Doesn't CSIS have some kind of source? Is there another source that could be recommended they use other than a CIA fact book as a source?
Yes, and Frans, please. It's your turn.
I just wanted to encourage Janet to keep courage, because very recently, as well in Germany, Belgium, as the Netherlands, our colleagues were invited to share about religious persecution in Iran. The governments were really interested to hear our view, and they considered that as a source apart from other sources, and that that was recently. In a way, we were very frustrated before, but suddenly it happened. So just want to encourage you to keep trying to, not necessarily only our material, but also other material on Christians, persecution of Christians, to keep trying to present that to the government and for these asylum cases.
Thank you. Franz, of course, speaking on behalf of Open Doors and World Watch Research.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Franz. Okay, Janet.
Great. Well, good questions. Thank you very much. And just by way of background, I'm a university professor, but I also have been doing advocacy on religious persecution with the Canadian government for about 20 years. And our government officials are, we have some of our parliamentarians were founding members of IPP-FORB. And on the political side, we have found quite a bit of interest. But on the refugee determination side, not as much interest. And I do think that there is a certain amount of religious illiteracy amongst the decision makers of the tribunal. Just by way of background, tribunal members are usually appointed for a 5-year term. So there needs to be ongoing training on religious issues. Yes, on the CIA fact book, there was a certain amount of irony that is seen as sort of the authoritative background source. But I think because the CIA produces the World Fact Book, other countries kind of feel like, well, why would we bother doing our own? But obviously the CIA may have its own bias. Speaking of bias. On the issue of why should NGO reports be considered, there are certain NGOs that are regularly considered, and we may want to consider what the biases of the Swiss Refugee Council, Amnesty International, Freedom House, what their biases may be. But it was interesting to me that there are certain NGOs that their reports are regularly included in the National Documentation Package, but other reports have not yet been considered authoritative enough to be included. But I think would certainly be value in the consideration of Pew reports, World Watch report being included, and certainly updating material so that you don't have something that's more than 10 years old that obviously does not reflect the current situation of religious groups. We know that there's been a lot of religious persecution in China, and other than Falun Dafa, material on the Uyghur Muslims had not, and Muslims in general who have been heavily persecuted in China, had not been updated either. And so I'm just, there may be so many other issues in China that the person who is updating that is not watching the religious issues, but obviously the religious issues are really quite considerable. And many of these reports, I think, do differentiate between different levels of persecution. So, yes, and Matthew, that's a very good point, that maybe influencing the organizations and making sure that the organizations that are being included have good documentation and reports as well. But I think most of the reports that we would be looking at do differentiate between different levels of religious freedom versus persecution and fear of imprisonment, hard labor, and fear or risk of death. I think that most of the reports do have that differentiation in them that would be valuable for anyone determining asylum seekers.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let's now move to another paper. Thank you, Janet. Thank you very much. By two authors that are now in the right time zone, I think. Niels de Nut and Anton van Dijk, on protecting the right to religion and belief. Freedom of Thought report using data to combat prosecution. Please, you've got 7 minutes, and welcome to both of you.
Okay, thank you so much for having us. I'm quickly going to share the Freedom of Thought report with you all. This is what it looks like these days. It's an international tool that's being regularly updated. It's interactive. You can click on every country you can see here, and it will take you to the country page. And on the country page, you've got 4 categories that they use to basically summarize what the condition is of freedom of religion or belief in that country. They make the distinction between constitution, government, education, society, and laws of expression. Now, the creation of this report is not done by one organization. It is curated by Humanist International, but they rely heavily on their local national member organizations for the input in this report. It's a qualitative report, but it also allows for quantitative data if that is present. For our paper, we decided to focus on the impact on policy levels and the impact on the field, you know, the religious communities themselves or the life science communities, because as you'll read in the paper itself, there is a very strong interaction between the both of them in both the creation and the impact of this report. One more thing that's quite important is that when we talk about freedom of religion or belief, it's that we always consistently add or belief. And this is because we want to consolidate the equal treatment between people with a theistic and or spiritual lifestyles and those with a non-religious lifestyles. That mostly has to do with ensuring that people have, they're protected by the same rights when they are either engaging in religious practices or belief practices. I'm going to keep it very short, and I'm going to cede most of my time to my dear colleague, Niels. Niels, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. As was said before, in a matter of Freedom of Thought report's potential influence on religious freedom policy initiatives, I think it's clear that the constellation of its initial backers, which were the humanist organizations, American Humanist Organization, Center for Inquiry, Richard Dawkins Foundation, and the Secular Coalition for America, was quite favorable as an influence. Although not necessarily massive in size, most of them were prominent humanist and free thought organizations in the US at that time. Added to this are the positions of the men providing the cover quote and the introduction, respectively. These were Professor Heiner Bielefeld, who at that time was the United Nations Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Religion or Belief, and Matt Cherry, equally the international representative for Humanist International of the NGO Committee of Freedom of Religion or Belief at the United Nations. Although actual research into the influence of the Freedom of Thought report as a policy-making tool is yet to be initiated, it's clear that the report is circulated to a variety of interested parties. We contacted some key figures and provide some tentative conclusions related to its efficacy. As stated by Ahmed Shahid, the current United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion, the Freedom of Thought report and its findings have been offered a strong basis for international advocacy on the subject and have increased the attention paid to the dimension of freedom of religion or belief. A fortiori, the inclusive approach of the report has increased the attention given to dimensions of freedom of religion or belief in other issues. As such, the Advocacy Director of Humanist International has been included in recent years in the Advisory Committee of the UN Office for Genocide Prevention and the Steering Committee on Faith for Rights initiative run by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. That same officer, Elizabeth O'Casey, added to Shahid's findings by summarizing some extra uses. These regularly include the staff of the European Union External Service in deciding which issues related to FORB to raise with non-member countries. It's further consulted by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations and United Nations Special Rapporteurs. A last example are the European Special Envoys of member states on freedom of religion or belief, who either use the report regularly or are at least familiar with its content. Lastly, the report has been presented at a European level In the intergroup, the Article 17 dialogue on religious and non-confessional organizations, and the European Parliament platform for secularism in politics. Another proposed question of this special issue, of course, is how religious freedom research can increase the resilience of religious groups to persecution. In this, we argue that the report has the ability to contribute to the resilience of both religious groups and non-religious groups in two ways. Firstly, the comparative nature of this report aids researchers in the field of freedom of religion to assess relatively the way religious and non-religious minorities are treated in every given country. The added value of the dataset lies at its global scale. By no means is any country or any one religious group targeted. Even some countries, generally considered Western, score rather poorly, actually. Secondly, the report is highly useful for campaigns on issues encountered by non-religious and fringe religious groups alike. Two prime examples are charges of blasphemy and apostasy, respectively. The importance of tackling these subjects is self-evident, knowing that, for instance, Pew Research found in 2016 that about a quarter of all countries at that time still have anti-blasphemy laws, and 1 in 10 had laws or policies condemning apostasy. Two prominent cases that we use in a paper are Muhammad Badawi and Ruslan Sokolovsky of the Pokemon Go trials. We feel that the Freedom of Thought report is a valuable research tool for those individuals aiming to increase the resilience of non-religious and religious groups. Its comparative dimension exposes countries' strengths and weaknesses in relation to issues concerned with freedom of religion or belief. Blasphemy laws, of course, are hardly unique to the Muslim world. One example is Ireland, which in 2018, of course, still had the word in its constitution. Throughout this talk, I think we have provided a backdrop for the production of the report. In doing so, it has become clear that this report has the potential to do much more than simply provide a status report. First of all, being a product of contributions by many of HI's members' organizations, the report amplifies the involvement of those members with their country's situation regarding freedom of religion or belief. Secondly, by collaborating on this report, said organizations are placed in contact with like-minded individuals around the globe. This provides an insight into each other's situation, structure, and campaigns. Added to this is the strengthening of a sense of community among humanist organizations. Third, the nature of the report aimed at increasing the level of freedom of religion in any given country presents the humanist organizations as positive contributors to issues that concern other life stances and religions, as opposed to presenting itself only at rights for non-religious. Fourth, I think, as stated by Shahid, the report shows that freedom of religion or belief is a part of other societal issues as well. In conclusion, although Humanist International is an NGO and not a research institution, the potential of this collaborative data set in policymaking cannot be understated. This is clearly reflected in the fact that Freedom of Thought report is a factor in the European Union External Service when deciding which issues related to freedom of religion or belief to protect or champion when working with the non-member countries, and the nature of the report as required reading for the EU's special envoys. Thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you very much, Niels. Anton, as well, for providing this very interesting overview of a totally different approach, but very relevant as well. I would like to invite Jason Klocek, please, to share his comments. And again, if there are any questions, please let me know through the chat. Jason, welcome.
Great, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's been a great morning, so I'm happy to comment on this paper. It was a really great read. And I think it underscores a neglect that a lot of us have, or at least the collection of data on religious freedom is characterized by, which is a neglect of thinking about how non-believers or people of no faith are persecuted and patterns there. So I'm thrilled that the paper is bringing to light that issue in general and the Freedom of Thought report specifically. I think the timing is critical as it represents a real opportunity to influence the planning, implementation, and dissemination of findings from efforts still in their early days. So in that sense, I think the paper has its own impact. To make that as forceful as possible, I wanted to mention 3 sets of questions that were raised as I was reading the paper. And those have to do with the paper structure, And then it's in the report's influence on policymakers and vulnerable groups. So just say something briefly about each. In terms of the structure, it's much appreciated. It's clear. The paper's aims are straightforward and it reads nicely. What I wanted to mention was that I would have benefited from a section devoted a bit more to the Freedom of Thought report itself. All of that information is in the current version and it's discussed just now, but it would be nice to combine it perhaps in a particular section that talks about the report, but also talks then about what's behind the aggregate categories. It wasn't exactly clear to me. Those could be footnotes. What sources are used, and most importantly, what are possible biases in those sources? Some of that could be footnotes, but the biases in particular I'd like to see in the text. To make room for that, I didn't find the discussion about the nature of humanism as useful for this particular paper. It's interesting background information, but I think it's sufficient to say the group is prepared by the humanist organization, which you mentioned on page 5. Now turning to the analytic claims, which I think I have a bit more to offer on as well. You mentioned that the Freedom of Thought reports, you're interested in its influence on policymakers and for vulnerable groups. Both fascinating lines of inquiry, both things we need to think about. In terms of the report's influence on policymakers, I'd love to read more about a more explicit framing of why we should expect it to have an effect in the first place. Again, there are hints littered throughout the paper. You mentioned sponsors that support the initiative. It might carry weight. I'd also imagine resources matter, money and staff to promote the report. So I'd love to see those factors spelled out more, and then you can rework what is already there to show whether those factors mattered or not. In this case, I also think that's another contribution because people later could look at those criteria and reassess the impact on policymakers. They could also use it to assess other reports on policymakers. So I think you have hints of something there that would be great just to spell out. I'm also curious about what key figures you spoke with. Are they representative figures? Do they have a vested interest in making the Freedom of Thought report sound more impactful than it is? Do they have other biases? I think all things you've probably thought about, but just nice to read more explicitly. And then finally, on this point, it isn't clear to me really what is meant by influence on policymakers. Similar to the other points I've made, I think you could be more explicit about how we would know if there was an impact. Is it the number of mentions or a reference by a high-ranking policymaker? Should we look for references in reports or just public statements? And there's a comment about use or familiarity. Those strike me as very different levels of influence. So again, I think this is littered in there. It's sprinkled. It'd just be nice to see it organized a bit more explicitly. And then finally, in terms of its impact on vulnerable groups, I find the argument clear and intriguing. It can contribute to the resiliency of religious and non-religious groups. But I wonder if you could say more about the global scale. It feels kind of just dropped in. The map is sort of just presented. Why does this trend matter? How can people use that? The second point you make about the report being useful for activists or campaigns is more compelling. There are lots of rich, detailed examples in the paper for those who haven't read it as closely. And I think those demonstrate what could be drawn upon. So I want to end on that positive note. This is a rich paper that clearly raised a lot of questions and ideas for me. And I think you just sharpening the analysis will make the impact of the report for policymakers and vulnerable groups all the more powerful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Niels, Anton, a brief comment?
Yeah, I think, well, Jason, thank you for your attentive read of the paper, I think. It's not as much questions that you raise as well as a very good peer review, in my opinion. Really telling us what you liked, what could be built upon. So I don't think I have much to say other than thank you, and we'll try our very best to make this the best version of this paper, content-wise and structure-wise as well. So thank you.
Very good. Well, let's move on then. We're not slowing down. Let's move on to the next paper, the religious challenges and risks of the Belt and Road Initiative by Jim Wallace. Jim, we look forward to listening to you. You've got 7 minutes.
Thank you. I'm at Boston University, where I work in the area of IR and religion. This paper is policy oriented. It is an outgrowth of lectures that I have given over the past year at both at Fudan University in Shanghai, as well as at the State Department and the Pentagon, and at National Intelligence University for the IC community. I'm trying in this paper to address things on both sides of this. Basically, I've set up a position that shows China versus the US and how they deal with religion and religion policy in this. The purpose is to promote discussion and debate, because there's a lot of different views on China and how they deal with religion, religious freedom. That comes back to the issue raised in the very first paper with Jonathan Fox about the definitions. How do we define religious freedom? I find it easier in China talking about religion policy in a lot of ways. So first of all, I deal with an overview of the Belt and Road Initiative, because frankly, a lot of people that you talk to just don't know what it is, or have a very vague understanding of what the Belt and Road is. It was announced first in 2013 by Xi Jinping, and then it really kicked off full blast with a conference in 2017, which is now held annually in Beijing. It involves 6 overland routes. That is the belt, the economic belt, and 1 maritime route, which is the maritime road. One of the challenges is there's not an official list from China of all the countries involved in this. So I used a World Bank list. It's a 2019 report by the World Bank, and I used their list of 71 countries that were direct partners with China on the Belt and Road, and 125 countries that have signed collaboration agreements. One of the challenges is that the BRI also involves countries like in South America that are not directly on one of the overland or maritime routes, but they are collaborating countries. I know this is of particular concern South America to the US military, Southcom, and the expansion of China into South America, and with AFRICOM, their expansion into Africa. Then I switched to the religion in the Belt and Road. There's so much that could be given here. I call upon the Pew data from the Pew Hostilities Index, as well as the Pew Diversity Index. And then I overlay that with data from the World Religions Database by Todd Johnson and Brian Grimm, which is housed at Boston University. When you look at religion, if the Belt and Road is meant to open up communications, travel, trade, commerce, back and forth from China all the way to the heart of Europe, it raises the question, then people are going to travel along that, and that includes religious peoples and religious groups. And how will China control that? How will China try to manipulate that according to their current policies? Will they try to force their policies on partner countries? And I raise that issue. Then I deal with the issue of religious freedom advocacy in the Belt and Road. I listed the history of sort of international religious freedom advocacy there, but I center in on the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom, which was held initiated by the US State Department 2018, 2019 in Washington, D.C., coming up in Poland. I was a participant in the 2019 event. And the birth of what's called the International Religious Freedom Alliance. And I detail in the paper the countries involved. Right now there's 28, that's the latest number from the Office of Religious Freedom at the State Department. 28 countries that are involved in the alliance, but 55% of those are also partner countries with China in the Belt and Road Initiative. They've signed agreements, they have projects going through their countries. So how will the partnerships with the China impact the work of the Earth Alliance? And I raise that question and what I see as a problem. Then next I go to the whole issue, and it could be a paper on its own, of the militarization of the Belt and Road. If you can travel commerce and communications and trade and people back and forth along these corridors, you can also travel militaries. And that's a huge concern to the US military, other militaries in the Five Eyes, but it's also a concern to China. And I have spoken with some senior religion policy officials in China, in Beijing, and they are aware that their military has no training in religion. They have no training, they have no expertise, they don't know how to deal with it, and they've run into problems actually in Africa, where they have UN peacekeeping troops who have been sort of stymied by the multiplicity of religions in Africa, and their soldiers don't know how to deal with it or deal with those people. But the US also has problems here because the Belt and Road covers 4 of the 6 US combat commands. So the way the US military divides up the world, 4 of the 6 are there, and those combat commands tend to operate individually when it comes to religion. They're impacted by the command chaplain, who reports directly to a 4-star, and the command chaplain is supposed to give advice not only on the care for the troops, but also on the religious dynamics of the battle space, what they call religion in the battle space. And so this has dynamics for religion too, both on the China side and on the US side. Finally, I conclude by saying that neither the US or China is seriously addressing the religious challenges and risk of the Belt and Road. Both are in a weak position. A conversation that I had with people at the State Department recently about this, they admitted that this is a concern to them, and they do not have a lot of expertise on the Belt and Road, and they need it. And I say this requires more study, data, and analysis to allow for good policy making. So that's a quick overview.
Yes, thank you, Jim, for keeping to the time. And this is a very interesting paper based on extensive original field information from the field. I would like to invite Dr. Ron Boyd-McMillan to respond to your paper. And then I believe Janet has also got a question she wanted to make. And also one other practical point, if you would like us to take a break, 10-minute break after this session, please send me a message via the chat. If not, then if you're comfortable continuing, then I think we should, just for the sake of time. But please, Ron, look forward to listening to you. Welcome, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Dennis, thank you. May I vote for that break, actually, as soon as this is over, but anyway. Thank you, James. I really did appreciate this. I just appreciated the focus on it. I was convening a gathering of 5 rather famous futurologists and asked them to put their #1 event, really, that affected the last 30, 40 years. And they all put 1978, the 4 modernizations. China opens up to the world. And yet we also talked about how this may be the biggest thing that we're living through now. So Belt and Road really does need to go onto people's agenda much, much more in strategy planning. It's evolving. It's probably even more spontaneous than it looks. As you know, when you look at a Chinese document, it looks very well worked out. But in fact, they are feeling their way. Deng Xiaoping was famously asked what his strategy was about the 4 modernizations. And he said, strategy? He said, I'll tell you how we cross a stream. We feel for the stones under our feet. And there's a lot of that going on with Belt and Road. So I appreciate bringing a focus to it. And all I really wanted to do was just to cheerlead for you. And also, the only question mark I suppose I had was this statement that there is a linkage, however dependent, however minor, between the PRC's national security strategy and religion. I think that's very true when it comes to certain religions. I don't think it is true compared to others. I happen to know for a fact that Xi Jinping gets briefed once a year on Christianity, 20 minutes. And the last time he had a briefing on it, he fell asleep. So his approach to religion is very, Christianity anyway, very technocratic. And so he's not bringing a lot of capital into this, but they definitely are about Islam, of course. So this is a good point. I just wanted to say that from Pakistan, where I do a lot of my work, we got very excited about this. About 3, maybe 5 years ago, we really felt that it would be a game changer in that it would bring more religious freedom into Pakistan. Because the theory was that since the Chinese were investing so much in the infrastructure, 60 billion it is now, they would insist that the Pakistan government crack down on its own violent jihadist groups, so that these groups would not damage the infrastructure that was being built. Mm-hmm. And that would actually create more freedom in another way for the Christians and so on. I have to say, it hasn't happened yet, because mainly the government seems to think that they've got China over the Gwadar port, rather than China has them. And so this has not happened yet, but it's early days, you know, with this. The big variable that wasn't mentioned, perhaps it's just space or perhaps it's just not your area, that really bears on your thesis though, is the attitude of the Chinese church here. This is a very large church, and many of them see BRI as a God-sent highway to take the revival to the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And this will cause the kind of tensions that you're talking about and highlighting them. In fact, we've already seen them in Pakistan. We have the biggest religious gatherings, actually, of a Christian description in Lahore are all organized by Chinese Christians, boss Christians, as they're called. Mm-hmm. And everybody wants to come and feed off them because they've got money. But what was interesting to me was that a woman, a Chinese, there were Chinese evangelists, and they appeared in Quetta, and they did some rather unwise evangelism, and they were both killed. And I was interested, I wondered what the Chinese would do about it, because I thought, well, everybody knows that they were extremely unwise. And so the Chinese will surely realize that. The Chinese government hit the roof. They were furious. And it's interesting, it confirms your thesis in many ways, because for them, it was racist. It was a racist incident. How dare the Christian community of Pakistan kill Chinese people? Who do they think they are? There was no sense and no interest in discovering a religious dimension to it, because Pakistani Christians could have said, if these believers had got in touch with them, that that's not the way you do evangelism in this part of the city, you know, otherwise your head's no longer on your shoulders. So I think it's a very important paper. Everybody should get this on their agenda. Belt and Road is a game changer all over the world. 4 billion people are going to be part of an economic bloc, and there aren't many geopolitical shifts that are more important than this. I would just love you, but it's up to you, to take this analysis a little beyond, you know, the diplomatic fencing and sometimes the downright posing of these very high-level advocacy initiatives, and push it down into tracking how it will change everything at a more visceral and grassroots level. This is where data like you get from the World Watch list, which hoovers up this bottom layer material, it can be very, very useful to it. But I thought this was wonderful. We could be seeing the equivalent of the 10th parallel in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of a conflict zone for religion, and this is well highlighted, and thank you for raising it so well, James.
Thank you very much, Ron, for your very informed comments. The reason why I ask you to be discussant, of course, is because I know of your experience in China. Okay, so now Janet, please, your question, and then Jim's response.
Yes, very much enjoyed this paper. I have seen, I've tracked a little bit with the Belfry Road Initiative and had some concerns about the religious impact for a number of different reasons. And I appreciate that you brought up many of the different dimensions. My question is very practical, that a map would be extremely valuable, an extremely valuable addition to this, to be able to see the breadth, to visualize the breadth of this. So I just, yeah, I have some other thoughts on this that you and I could discuss offline, but that was really my recommendation.
Jim?
Okay, thank you. I'll start with Janet. Yes, I considered a map. I consider there were 2 or 3 things, but I didn't know because of the space limitations that Dennis had given us if that would be appropriate. I'll discuss it with him, but yeah, a map sure would be helpful. Ron, appreciate your comments and your insight very much, and your experience and your knowledge in this area. And I just made a number of notes. I'm going to look at and see how I can incorporate some of those. One of the things about pushing it down, you know, I intentionally left this at a high level because I have been encouraged to write on this for a number of months. And I have been waiting to find the right journal to put something in that was not a US journal and not a Chinese journal, so that it could be listened to by both sides. And this article in its final form will be shared with senior people at State, at Pentagon, in the IC community, as well as in the United Front Work Department in China. And they know that. And it gives them something in writing that they can use as they address some of these issues. So that's part of why I shaped it, but I think your comments bear me looking at further and seeing how I can incorporate some of that in that. So I appreciate that very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jim, for your reaction. So, because there seems to be a consensus that we need a break, we're going to take a break. This is very democratic. Well, let's reconvene 10 minutes from now, please. So that would be at, I'm confused with the time zones now. 10 minutes from now, that would be at
15:50
at 16 hours, at 4 p.m. Amsterdam time. Yes. So yeah, we'll be back. And also, if you want to stay updated, those who are not authors of this special issue, about the publication of the special issue, please just drop your email in the chat, and I'll make sure we keep you informed. So see you in 10 minutes. Want ik denk, want aan 2 moet ik drinken. Dan heb je ook water gehad. Nou, ik heb het groot pot water. Dus dat is dan nog niet echt door.
Zeg je? Zeg je?
Ben je nu met iets bezig?
Nee, nee.
Nou, omdat je wel zo'n ding aan hebt.
Ja, in pauze.
Dan heb je geluid wel aan.
Weet je wel?
Okay, it's 1600 again, 4 p.m. So I think we're ready to continue. And the next speaker scheduled is, let me check. Yes, Kareem MacDonald, regulating religious diversity in an asylum center context, Danish asylum center managers' attitudes, knowledge and policies towards religion and freedom of religion. Kareem, please, we already welcomed you and we look forward to listening to your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction. The idea for my research emerged from what I perceived as a convergence between the subject's relevancy, practical relevance, and a gap in the literature. What I mean by that is that over the last couple of years, the Danish media have reported on instances, cases in which asylum seekers have been attacked, harassed, intimidated, apparently on account of their religious beliefs, or with religion having some role in these attacks. And other reports have highlighted the frustration of local religious leaders in terms of the approaches of asylum center managers towards issues of religious practice in asylum centers. And at the same time, if we look at the academic literature, and the topic of freedom of religion within an asylum center context is a very underdeveloped and under-researched topic. And in terms of international human rights law, there is some regulation in terms of freedom of religion within closed asylum centers, but in terms of the vast majority of asylum centers which are open, in which asylum seekers can come and go as they please, it's very unregulated. So the focus, as the title indicates, is looking at how asylum center managers manage the religious diversity of asylum centers and how they manage issues of religious practice. And my research interviewed 7 asylum center managers who were Red Cross asylum center managers. In the Danish asylum system, about half of the asylum centers are managed by the Danish Red Cross, with the other asylum centers being run by different municipalities or directly by the immigration service. So in terms of managing the religious diversity and conflict in asylum centers, the first thing to say is that asylum centers are the settings for religious diversity. Now, what is the extent of this diversity in terms of demographics? It's very difficult to get an accurate picture of the religious demography of these asylum centers, because I mean, because firstly, nobody really records the religion of asylum seekers. The only place where the religion of asylum seekers is recorded is at the first interview between the asylum seeker and the Danish Immigration Service. And those documents remain closed. Asylum center managers don't have access to them, nor do other people. And so in trying to paint a picture of the religious diversity, our information is only anecdotal or what the asylum center managers or religious leaders are telling us, or by trying to make infersions from where the asylum seekers come, their nationalities. When I spoke with the asylum center managers about the possibility of religious conflict in the asylum centers and asked them about some of the cases that the Danish media reported on, it was fair to say that most of the asylum center managers really thought that religion was an irrelevant explanation in conflict. They talked to me about cases where, for example, there was a conflict in the shared kitchen between asylum seekers, where in one case, a group of Muslim asylum seekers were annoyed that a non-Muslim asylum seeker was cooking pork in the shared kitchen. And an argument broke out about it, and the non-Muslim asylum seeker was called dirty and unclean. And the asylum center managers told me that this was nothing to do about religion. religion was not at all a relevant factor in explaining that conflict. It was about issues of living together. In another case, an asylum seeker, apparently a Muslim asylum seeker, was playing the Islamic call to prayer on his phone in a shared bedroom. The non-Muslim asylum seeker asked him to turn it off or turn the volume down, and he refused, and apparently quite provocatively insisted on playing it out loud. And again, asylum center managers told me, oh, well, you shouldn't read too much into this. This is about issues of living together. And so the point is that religion isn't always going to be a relevant factor in explaining conflict, but the point is that managers were going to the extremes of seeking to exclude religion as a relevant factor, which I don't think is particularly helpful. The result, of course, of that is that when you speak with local religious leaders and they're telling you that religion is at the heart of these conflicts, and asylum center managers have a very different category for analyzing these conflicts, is that you get a very distorted image of the extent of religious conflict in the asylum centers. And just one final point in this section is that I actually encountered a lot of suspicion and cynicism from asylum center managers in terms of their attitudes when they receive reports about asylum seekers being harassed and intimidated. In many cases, they told me that these cases weren't genuine, that these were more attempts by some asylum seekers to seek favorable preferential treatment rather than being genuine cases. And so, in summarizing asylum center managers' attitudes towards religious conflict, we can see that religion and any religious explanations to conflict, they're very eager to push it away and out of the explanatory equation, perhaps conscious that this was a topic in the media at the time, and so they didn't want to give credence to some of these complaints. But went to the extreme, therefore, of denying religion at all as having a relevant role in explaining these conflicts. In terms of religious practice, I asked asylum center managers, they were asked about their knowledge of freedom of religion, about the dimensions of freedom of religion, and in summary, I mean, asylum center managers, they displayed a very limited and at best elementary understanding of what freedom of religion was about, an understanding confined to the forum internum rather than the forum externum. So they failed to, for example, say that, well, it included the right to worship and to congregate with others, etc. And in terms of the guidance that asylum center managers are working with, I mean, they're working with no guidance whatsoever. The contract between the Immigration Service and the Red Cross, who manage a lot of these asylum centers, they don't mention anything about religion. And so what you had is a knowledge and policy deficit. And this knowledge and policy deficit then resulted in a myriad of incoherent and contradictory approaches. So just to make that clear, asylum center managers are not understanding what freedom of religion is about. They have no guidance as to how they should protect freedom of religion within an asylum center context. And I could see how this was resulting in very contradictory approaches between asylum center managers and actually with individual asylum center managers. For example, some asylum center managers were open to the idea of prayer rooms in the asylum centers, while some of them said they would permit it for individual worship. Others said, no, that wouldn't be acceptable, but we could allow it for collective worship. So there was no coherency here. There's very different approaches, and the same is for the display of notices, religious notices about services, religious services in the local area of the asylum center. Some managers said yes, some said no, and the same is the same for other aspects of religious practice. And so we had this real mix and patchwork of different approaches. And finally, in terms of the justifications for these approaches, by far the most common justification for asylum center managers' approaches to religious diversity and religious practice was this idea of needing to be religiously neutral. But the problem here is that it became clear that neutrality was understood very differently among asylum center managers. Sometimes it was understood in a very restrictive way, where any form of religious practice needed to be in private. It could not be expressed at all in the public parts of the asylum center. While at other times, asylum center managers seem to have no problem with displaying a Christmas tree. Now, of course, we can discuss about to what extent the Christmas tree is representative of Christianity. But what was interesting is one of the asylum center managers told me that at Christmas time they sung songs around the Christmas tree with the asylum seekers, and some of the songs that they sung contained explicitly Christian lyrics. And so when I questioned the asylum center managers, well, how do you reconcile that sort of action with your supposed position of being religiously neutral? Well, then they admitted that it was quite gray and their understandings were not so clear. And so once again, you had this an incoherency and contradiction in approaches to religious practice, and contradictions and incoherency in terms of justifications for religious practice. And to sum up, then, I think what this really just illustrates is that this is a topic that really is underdeveloped and under-researched and needs studied. And I suppose this journal article is about the impact of religious freedom of research. And I think what, in a way, what this does is shows us is the impact of the absence of religious freedom research when this topic is very under-researched, and you can kind of see some of the sort of consequences of this lack of attention at an academic level and at the legal level. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Karim. Very, very interesting, of course. So now I would like to ask Jonathan Fox to be the discussant of your presentation.
Okay, Karim, I very much enjoyed reading your paper. It's particularly appropriate for this conference, which is sort of connected to Dennis's dissertation, where he went and looked at what was going on with religion in places no one ever looked before, and you're very much doing that in a different context. So thematically, this works really nice. Paper's largely descriptive, which is appropriate at the initial stages. The first thing you have to do is figure out what's going on, and you seem to still be in that stage. So I'm gonna give you a few comments that I think might help you move on to the next stage. In the paper itself, you seem to know what you mean by religious freedom, but you very much bury it in the paper and don't really state it outright, at least what conception you're using. It would be helpful both for you and for the reader just to be clear about what you mean. It's less important what your definition is than that you have one and you're clear about what it is. And as you saw from my paper, people don't agree on what religious freedom means, but you do have to pick a definition if you're going to be talking about it. As best as I can tell, your definition of religious freedom is the right to have religious belief, the right to various types of practices with the acknowledgement that maybe some limitations could be allowed, and the right to have or choose a religion. If I'm wrong, that's fine. But I think that would be helpful. And I think you might want to ask yourself two related questions. What does this case tell me about religious freedom in general, as we might see it in other cases? And what from other cases might inform this case? To start maybe comparing a little bit across cases to illuminate what's going on. And I think that would be a nice way for you to proceed from the descriptive to moving to more theoretical, to give it a bit more of a theoretical background where you have something more to say than just about this initial case. And I do have one comment about one item. In your paper somewhere you mentioned that 1.5 to 3.5% of the people coming were converts to Christianity, and you dismissed it as a small number. That's a huge number. Getting that number of people from a population converting from, say, Islam to Christianity is very high. So you sort of address it, but you might want to ask the question, did they convert to come, or did they come because they converted? I don't think you have an answer to that, but that would be a very interesting question to look into. Again, a very interesting paper. You're looking into religious freedom in an area that no one's looked into it before, and that can't be anything besides useful.
Great, thank you for your feedback, Jonathan. I believe Niels also has a comment to make, and then I would like to ask Karim to respond.
Yeah, it's part of an addition, I think. You spoke about knowledge deficit for asylum seeker administrators, I think. And what was interesting last year at an event at the European Union Parliament, there was an event on non-believers seeking asylum in Europe. And some organizations, of course, humanist organizations, have gained some headway in really informing and leaning on their government. I think Humanist UK was there, the HV of the Netherlands. I think, and my German is very poor, so forgive me, but Adresische Flüchtlingshilfe from Germany was there as well. And some of them have really made headway in educational projects on really getting the asylum seeker administrators to understand what non-religion and religion is, and why apostasy, for instance, might be worthwhile seeking asylum. So I would like to email you the information if it's interesting to you from a comparative perspective, so that maybe you can work with that. Like I said, more an addition than it is a comment.
Great, great. Everything is useful. Karim, reaction?
Thank you both for your comments. In particular, Jonathan, thank you for those very helpful comments. And it's definitely something I have to think about, particularly I found your paper very interesting in terms of what is religious freedom and various ways in which religious freedom can be understood. And I think that's something I can weave into to my own paper. So thank you for your points, and I'll be in touch with you if I need to follow up on some of these points, if that's okay.
Excellent, excellent. We really want to promote this kind of synergy, collaborative work, so that's great. Let's move to the next paper by Ron Boyd Macmillan, Towards a Theory, if not a Theology, of Extinction. Yes, Ron, please, we look forward to listening to you.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah,
yes.
Good. I had a tutor at Cambridge who we used to say, well, why didn't you deal with what you promised? And he said, oh, that was a promise made under Martini, he would say. I was under the influence at the time, and I thought, what the heck was I on when I promised Towards a Theory, if not a Theology, of Extinction? Some very mineral white wine, I think. And you'll see on the paper that I've changed it a little, but what I'm just trying to do, and dipping my toe in at this point, is just to take up this challenge that Philip Jenkins gave us in that little book, The Lost History of Christianity, where he said, why don't we try to come up with as much effort in figuring out how churches die as to how they grow. Everybody, we've got it's big business, frankly, in the Christian world as to how churches grow, but how do they die? And so this is my very, very initial attempt, and there's a long way to go with this. When does persecution, if you like, revive the church, and when does it kill it? And I thought perhaps the best way to have a crack at that is to take it on a macro scale, because then you can really see when persecutions had a sort of semi-permanent or even permanent effect. So I came up with this idea of what was a global persecution, and tried to argue that there are 5 of them. A global persecution has these characteristics where it's not confined to a single country, but covers the known world at the time. It's not just going on in one place. Where it lasts for more than a single generation, I think this is a critical element. And finally, where it radically alters the religious landscape for many, many years afterwards, including the permanent damage, if you like, of the church. And so from just reading around and trying to expose the people that I was speaking to, because what I was finding is that when I talked about this, everybody thought automatically that when persecution comes, the church revives. And so I thought, well, how do I challenge this? And so this is where I said, well, look at the larger history, look at big history, the equivalent of big history, as it were, in the church. And is this always the case? And so I argue that in these 5 sort of global persecutions that it doesn't necessarily always revive the church. The Roman persecution is the one that I talk a little bit about in the paper, running from 250 to 313 AD, although it's really into kind of 2 moves. But it's launched by the Emperor Decius, and it essentially has this idea that he's out to try to create apostates rather than martyrs, and so discord into the church that creates real danger and thin out the numbers. Then you have the Islamic persecution, which is really 635 to 950 or 1000 AD. And that's more where you try to marginalize Christians through taxation and through creating a kind of dimitude. Of course, there's violence always in those days. But it's more the fact that you're trying to create a second-class citizenry so that over time, it just becomes too hard to maintain the distinctive. And that did have a massively permanent effect on Christianity in the Middle East and significantly in Asia. Then we have the Mongol persecution, as I talk about it. When the Mongols become Christians, become Muslims, that is, because up until some of them, they're not Muslims, and they are pretty much the most violent people in history. The 14th century is still the most violent century we ever had. And people like Tamerlane finishes essentially Christianity off, or renders it as a very small minority in Asia. And Jenkins actually is quite good at charting that. Then I talk about the Christian persecutions of the 16th, 17th centuries for better. I talk about 1517 to 1648, really, where Christian persecutes Christian, usually over things to do with the meaning of baptism or the meaning of the Lord's Supper and so on. And you get this arrangement, really, where you cannot be a Protestant in a Catholic state or vice versa. And then finally, I talk about the atheistic persecution of the 20th century, which, for all intents and purposes, dates from 1917, which is when communism as an ideology took over a state. It had been around before then, but this is when it became a state. And of course, I suppose you could argue that the idea is still going on, and that seems to be, to do with the control of education. Anyway, I'm arguing through these that how do we get to an idea of an understanding of how churches die or wither away or get permanently weakened, and to deal with on this scale might be useful. And so I try to bring in Kenneth Scott Latourette, who talks about Christianity in terms of 3 advances and 3 recessions, and how, if you look at his conception, I would argue that actually it maps on quite well to the 3 recessions. But you can look up that a bit more. So in the end, what I'm driving to is a kind of preliminary idea that maybe there are 2 elements that come together, and if they do, the church is permanently weakened. One is what I call the time element, where the persecution lasts from generation to generation. does Christianity, or any other religion for that matter, have a defense against the persecution that really goes on for, say, 100 years or 150 years? That is the question. And there was a Samuel Moffat, the great missionary to Korea, used to say, you have to figure out when persecution is either cutting the branches or cutting the trunk. And he said, if it cuts the branches, if it's of short duration, persecution revives the church. If it cuts the trunk, that's the end. That's not always easy in practice to discern, but one is trying to move into an awareness. Well, what is that? How would that be operationalized in terms of understanding what you're up against when you're in a persecuted situation? And then that's the time element. The second is what I call the totality element, where the persecutor, as it were, creates a culture that is inhospitable to the daily exercise of the faith, so that over time it becomes harder and harder to stay faithful to one's faith community. And that time may be, you might be the second or the third or the fourth generation. And I'm borrowing a little bit on that one, on a social theory of conversion that you would find in the likes of, say, Rodney Stark, although he didn't originate the theory. When these two elements come together, perhaps, the time element and the totality element, it seems to become quite hard for Christianity to keep transmitting the faith. And because the society is set up to repel the exercise of Christian witness, and it makes the Christian fight every day to be distinctive. And so over time, that just becomes too hard. That's the idea. And so if you're, because this is I'm trying to incorporate this in a very practical course, I say that I'm arguing that the best way to be resilient in the face of persecution is to build a culture, or even a subculture, if you can't build a culture, that never lets Christians as a community forget Jesus Christ on a daily basis. And so, as you see in the paper, I go a little bit into the impact that the Decian persecution has. Decius's particular method was to try to create apostates rather than martyrs. And the effect of that was to sow such a discord in the church that they had to figure out, how do you let an apostate come back into the fellowship? And that essentially birthed the whole medieval spirituality of penance, of how you bring people back in. And I would argue, in fact, that wasn't a strength. That was a weakness. And in fact, you're going to get that rebelled against very, very powerfully in the Reformation itself. Anyway, the key term is transmission. When we talk about persecution and resisting persecution, transmission is, I believe, a word we don't use enough. How do you transmit the faith from one generation to another? Persecutors are smart. They can think intergenerationally. The kind of persecution that really damages a church within a generation perhaps is not so important as the kind of persecution that damages the intergenerational transmission methods. And so I'm trying to get to this with this, but as I said, it was the equivalent of John Bowker's promises made under Martini, and I hope that is recognized. I probably won't push on with this for the moment, because I see that obviously it's a massive spread of information. I wish Philip Jenkins would just set about doing it, but I've sent him umpteen emails, and he says, I've moved on to something else, thank you very much. So some of us will have to do it, but I'm dipping a toe in and seeing what comes up with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron, indeed. And I think it's excellent to try to be ambitious in any case. There's nothing wrong with that. So I would like to invite Marcello Bartolini to please be the discussant for Ron's paper. And I believe Jonathan Fox also had a question. Did you raise your hand? Yeah, okay, so but Marcello first and then Jonathan, please.
Thank you, Dennis. Before I make some comments about the essay entitled "Does Persecution Always Bring Growth? 5 Global Persecutions Suggest the Opposite," I would like to congratulate Professor Ronald Boyd Macmillan for his research, which I found very interesting and with a narrative that traps the reader like a good novel. In his essay, Professor Boyd Macmillan begins by saying how Christian pastor Samuel Lamb, who was a leader in the Chinese house church movement, known for his resistance to state control and imprisoned for over 20 years for his faith in Christ, told every visitor without fail, persecution promotes growth, and prayed that his mostly Western visitors would have more persecution for more growth. He also commented that some influential leaders of the persecuted church have vowed the idea that persecution and the growth of a religious organization go hand in hand. In other words, there is a cause and effect relationship between persecution and growth. As when we were children and our relatives explained us that adversity is like the air current that lifts the kite up to the heaven, and that if little is good, much is better. However, the author, after reviewing the 5 main persecutions of the church throughout the history, questions whether Pastor Samuel Lamb's phrases, which in some way reflect popular wisdom, are always true and whether they can be applied to any type of religious persecution. To this end, I'll be shorter. In short, this is a provocative reading challenging the popular wisdom and empirical learning of a martyr and important religious leader in China, while warning us of a saturation point in the resilience of the people and their institutions. This saturation point has been explored in other areas of knowledge and could be explained, for example, by the law of decreasing marginal utility, in which as the consumption of the good increases, the increases in utility or satisfaction produced by each additional unit are smaller and smaller. What this law points out is that utility increases with the consumption of the goods, but more and more slowly until it reaches a point equal to 0, called the saturation point, which taken to the subject at hand would represent a religious growth whose value could be equal to or less than 0 under certain circumstances. It also evokes in my mind the memory of the biblical passage of the Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, which says, "I say to you that you are Peter, and on this stone I will build my church, and the gates of the hell shall not prevail against it." However, I cannot stop thinking like a lawyer. And when I'm looking for the small and thin letters at the bottom, I find no warranty that it refers to a particular territory, state, or region. I realize then that perhaps it refers to the church as an instrument for the salvation of mankind, which is not confined to certain walled city of the past or to one of the political and geographical demarcations created by the man, which inevitably change over the years. Perhaps it refers to a church as a whole in a constant movement with its fat cows and its thin cows, which one day is located in a town of Canaan, the other in Egypt, then in Jerusalem, and that after several wars, often persecutions, spreads to all corners of the world as a great diaspora of refugees and missionaries, which makes its total extinction more difficult. That's why I have 2 questions for Ronald. The first one is, why didn't you talk about other factors such as social movements like migrations, missions, or the equivalent of a theory of communicating vessels? And the second one, how can we rethink or understand this theory of extinction in an era of globalization and internet? Thank you.
Marcelo, thank you very much. Jonathan.
Okay, I just had a quick thought. Not a huge expert on the history of Christianity, but if you really want to discuss religion surviving persecution, have you considered looking at Judaism?
Can you say a little more, Jonathan?
Well, Jews survived almost 2 millennia under the Romans and then the Christians. Most of the time they were persecuted in many different ways. I'm actually working on a book on the topic, although I'm looking more at why do people discriminate against Jews than how Jews survive. We just do. But I just think the Jewish case is a case where there's been persecution of all kinds over a very long period of time, and the Jews survived. You might want to look at that. That might impact on your theory.
There is a book, James D. Hunter's book on, I'm blanking on the name, but it does go through the history of that. And of course, Hunter's thesis is that Christianity, if it's truly practiced, is always a minority. And so there is that element to it. And also, as you say, Marcelo, there does need to be some understanding of what does the law of undulation mean in this setup. You know, there are times when Christianity advances and times when it recesses. This just is the way it is. You know, to what extent are we going against what is natural in terms of a long process, because we're talking 2,000 years, and what is unavoidable, because if we do certain things, then we'll get different results. So I take those points. I'd love your thoughts, Marcello, if you can send them to me, because I want to think them through more carefully, and they were well expressed, but it sounded like you had them written down. So if you would send them to me, I'd be very grateful.
Of course.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for your comments. We're about halfway through what we wanted to do today, and our time is almost over. This is actually the moment well, we agreed I would hand the chair over to Govert, so I'll do that now. But yeah, Govert, maybe you can also lead us into a discussion on whether we decide to continue a bit longer today or we reconvene next week. Govert, please.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Dennis, and thank you for chairing the session for such a long time. So that's excellent. Yeah, I think we're not going to make it this afternoon to do some justice to all the papers and the richness. Even if we speed up the process, I think our physical restraints are there too in terms of fatigue, etc. So I propose that we do 2 more, and that we then basically finish and then continue next week, if that is possible for each of us. A week from now, again at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Amsterdam time, the same time as we did now. Is that?
Well, actually, as I announced in my email, it would be at 3 o'clock.
Oh, at 3 o'clock. Oh, at 3 o'clock.
So 1 hour later. Yeah.
Yeah, no, at 3 o'clock. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that fine that we shall then do it in this way? Yes, I see a thumb up, so perhaps there are others too. I don't know, but yeah. So if we do then two more now, and then we close off, and we then next week at 3 o'clock. Then yeah. Okay. Well, then I would now give the floor to Jason Klocek. Opportunity and challenges for religious freedom research to inform policy initiatives in a polarized America. Yeah?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. What I heard is the last 2 papers can take as much time as we want, because that's it then.
Yeah, that's not. I really want to close as close to 5 as possible. So thumbs down, yeah. So I will watch your time. So you have 7 minutes. You can start now. So
perfect. Okay, I'm just kidding. Let me start by
yes.
introducing myself and making a disclaimer. So I'm Jason Klochek. I'm a research fellow at the University of Notre Dame and also a senior researcher at the United States Institute of Peace. I'm supposed to emphasize that everything I'm saying is in my Notre Dame affiliation, not in my affiliation with USIP. So with that said, the paper that I'm presenting actually tries to reflect on some of the work that I'm doing between the lines of academia and policy world. And I also just say I can't ask for a better discussant, I think, than Jim, who has actually done some of the things I'm writing about. So I'm looking forward to his comments. The motivation for the paper is really a single mention in a 159-page document that USAID, or United States Agency for International Development, recently released. In that single sentence, certain missions that USAID works with now are required to incorporate religious freedom into the way they plan and implement their program cycle. This is unprecedented in terms of US aid development, but long in the making. And so my paper tries to think about how international religious freedom research can impact this changing policy in DC, particularly in a polarized environment. So the short answer is with difficulty and tension. And the long answer is by navigating but not ignoring the politics that have led to this change in US policy. In short, the paper takes 3 moves. The first reflects on how we got to this moment. The second is it asks what are the opportunities and challenges in this current moment for how research can best inform policymakers, if at all. And then third, I offer some modest recommendations, which I hope I'll get the most pushback from. I'll just say a few things on each. I'm going to keep it short so that we do end by the top of the hour. When I reflect on sort of how we got to this moment, and while I use the United States as the central case of how religious freedom research can inform policy in a polarized environment, I don't think it's exclusive to the United States. So you could think of other cases where this might be happening in Europe and elsewhere. But the US is the context I'm most familiar with and the one I'm working within. And it's also quite interesting how we got to that moment. I could have written a section about how the polarization around religious freedom just reflects the broader polarization in the United States, and that is there. But what I tried to do was highlight some of the organizational shifts that have occurred across various administrations. So for those, I'm sure everyone here is familiar that in 1998, the International Religious Freedom Act was passed nearly unanimously, a couple abstentions in the Senate. But generally, there was a broad-based multi-faith coalition in 1998, and that sort of ebbed and flowed over the years. What I try to highlight in terms of how we got to this moment is how organizational changes across Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations are one reason for that, or at least reflect that. So it was really the move to open the Office for Religion and Global Engagement under the under the Obama administration that shifted resources and prioritized that over international religious freedom. And now you see that pendulum switching back under the Trump administration. The Office for Religion and Global Engagement was eliminated or folded into, depending on who you talk to, folded into the Office for International Religious Freedom, but some aspects of it were eliminated, such as the special envoys. In other ways, so anyways, so that's what I do in the historical section. I really appreciate any comments that we have, particularly Jim, if anything I can cut there, anything I can get more accurate. I'm sort of writing that without some of my main resources because I'm stuck in the apartment. But anyways, in essence, it demonstrates that we're at a particularly unique moment, not just because the pendulum's swinging back, because there's a real demand, a demand that's being fueled by the administration, but also people that I've been working with in DC who are very eager to incorporate this, but are also relatively unequipped. And so I'll just mention that I point out 2 opportunities in that moment. One is that there really is a high demand right now in DC circles, both because there are more resources and more staff to do this, but also one thing that I hope is highlighted in this paper is that some of these organizations like USAID were not, they've admittedly not fully prepared. So they're asking big questions, going all the way to John's first paper, what is religious freedom? How do we measure it? So they're really interested in this concept and how they can best incorporate it but with a pragmatic lens, right? They want to know how they can really incorporate this into their programmatic cycles, not so much theoretical debate. So that's one opportunity. The other opportunity, so the opportunity is both there's a demand and also then an interest in expanding the way they think about religious freedom. A lot of people in the development space think about it as discrimination against religious minorities on economic or political grounds. And they're starting to grapple what it means to really discriminate against religion or the public or private practice of one's religion. So opportunities or demand and what I call sort of broader conceptualization or conversations. In terms of challenges, I think there are three, I'll call them unevenness. There's uneven interest. There are certain parts of the US government right now that are more interested in this than others. So as one prime example, the organization I work with at USAID is for faith-based and opportunity initiatives. The broader USAID network is still catching up. So there's uneven interest amongst US organizations. There's uninterest impact. Certain organizations are listening more than others. And most importantly, just to keep it short, there's uneven perception, right? There are real questions about what an increase in research on religious freedom being funded by the current administration means in terms of who's accepting these findings and possible biases. In terms of recommendations, I recommend that we proceed with caution. There seem to be a lot of there's a lot of new opportunities, and people will be quick to capitalize on them. I actually get papers almost monthly now of people who are doing new research on religious freedom and want to bring it to the attention of the project that I'm leading, which are taking pretty shallow cuts at what we think about religious freedom. So we should be careful about how quickly we move towards this. We shouldn't abandon nuance. Policymakers, of course, want really clear, crisp examples, but there's a lot of complexity, and that's part of the project that I'm working on, just trying to look at. And then finally, we need to think about the politics behind this, and we need to take a long-term view is my recommendation, that there will be these ebbs and flows in terms of interest in international religious freedom. And we need to think about that in terms of how the questions we ask and the way we go about our research. So that's broadly what the paper is outlining. Really looking forward to Jim's comments in the broader conversation. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. Yes, this is interesting stuff. And James, you made already some comments earlier about the American situation. So perhaps you can, from that background, give your comments as well to Jason's paper.
Okay, let me unmute there. All right. Thank you, Jason. I certainly read this paper with interest because this is my wheelhouse in an area I've worked in for many years. I realize this is a first draft for you, and you said in your email that you didn't have access to some of your resources, and I appreciate that. First off, I would say your comments now and your comments in your abstract seemed more broad and nuanced than some of the statements actually in the paper. And I disagree with what came across in the paper as your fundamental premise, and that is that basically things changed and began to really increase significantly in 2016 with the Trump administration. You give a lot of credit to the Trump administration, and I'm familiar with what they do. But you miss historically a number of important things. You do not deal at all with the 2016 passage of the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, which amended the 1998 one and expanded it. And some of the things that you pointed to that you said came because of the Trump administration were actually in the 2016 law that was passed and signed during the Obama administration. And so I think there's some things there that you need to make sure that you include and clean up historically. Secondly, I struggle some with your definitions. You kept talking about the left, and you never defined who the left was. Was the left the Democratic Party? Was it the liberal left? What is the left? And then the right, who is the right? Again, those things were not defined. Then you set up a dichotomy of religious engagement versus religious freedom, which seemed to me to be a false dichotomy. really the two approaches are religious engagement versus religious advocacy. And if you talk to people in the IRF department or the RGA, when it was in existence, they would characterize it as a difference between engagement and advocacy. But if you look at things now, engagement has been molded into the IRF office, and the part of the IRF office that's expanding right now is the engagement part. If you look at the people who head that up and what they're doing and you talk to the senior people in IRF, they will tell you that engagement is what they're expanding. I struggled also with some of the partisan tone of the paper. You kept talking about what the Trump administration did, the Republicans did, with very little recognition of what had happened with others. And you didn't note that when Brownback was appointed, before him was Ambassador Saperstein under Obama. And there was a huge push, particularly by people you mentioned, like Tom Farr and Nina Shea and others, to keep Saperstein. They wanted Saperstein to stay in the office of Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom. And the Trump administration removed him and then put Brownback in there. But there was a lot of support for keeping Saperstein and letting him sort of bridge between the two administrations. You didn't note that a lot of the IRS staffers at state who deal with the policy at a very basic level have been there through Bush, Obama, and now Trump. And so there's a bipartisanness in the IRF office that is not captured in this paper. You didn't talk about the bipartisanness in Congress. A lot of Democrats support religious freedom initiatives in Congress, including people like Jim McGovern, Democratic of Massachusetts, who heads up the China Commission on religion and deals with that, on human rights. You didn't talk about
just for time's sake, James. Can you just
I'm going to
wrap up your points?
I'm going to wrap up my points. Yes, I am.
Okay. Yeah.
You didn't note that in the 2019 ministerial, Nancy Pelosi was invited to speak and was interviewed by Brownback, and Brownback praised her in her support of religious freedom. So there's a whole bunch there. I felt like your conclusions, the last part, were actually pretty good. They were nuanced. There were some good ideas there, and I would commend those. But I think there's some other holes that need to be filled up.
Okay, thank you. Jason, you want to give a short reply?
Very short. First, I appreciate all the comments. Second, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of nuance that's hard to cover in 4,000 words. And I already caught Frank Wolf, for example, was in another version. But let me emphasize that I really appreciate that you point out that there's a bit more going on prior to the Trump administration. But I do want to capture that. And that I'm well aware of it. So for example, in the USIP project, we have Ambassador Saperstein working with us on an advisory committee. So everything you mentioned is fantastic, and I'll look forward to carrying on the conversation. Thank you very much.
Glad to.
Okay, thank you. In my chat, I don't see others who want to respond. So then we can continue. Yes, I think. The next on my list is the paper of Maytal Pinto and Ashley Schulstein, but I didn't receive that one yet, I think. So is that correct? Should we then postpone it to next week? Is that correct? Or?
So I'm really sorry that I didn't have the time to put the paper together. The pandemic time was really difficult here with 2 children home and trying to work from home. So what I basically did is just build a very short presentation. I will now share it on screen.
Okay, great. Yes. Okay, thank you. Go ahead. Yes.
So, okay. So just, my name is Maytal Pinto. I'm an expert on constitutional law and jurisprudence. And Racheli Schulstein is an expert on Jewish law. So, and we also work together in Israel. So we collaborated on this project. Well, what we're trying to do here is to check, or maybe to estimate whether minorities within minorities, when they raise claims in Israel, are they doing it in the right terms? And we suggest that they are not, that they should be appealing to the right to religious freedom when in fact they do not do it. So in order to advance the claim, we are looking at 3 different cases. So bear with me, they are very Israeli in their context. The first one, the one is called Plonit versus the Sharia court. Plonit is like a Jane Doe. So we have a Muslim woman who is in a divorce proceeding, and she insisting on having a female arbitrator in the Sharia court. And the Sharia court doesn't allow her. It says that women cannot serve as arbitrator according to the Muslim religious law. That's the first one, and she reached the Supreme Court of Israel that in the end accept her petition and actually force the Sharia court to nominate a female arbitrator as she asked. This is the first one. The second one, Rubinstein versus the Knesset, it's a constitutional case, and it deals with the constitutionality of a law that exempts ultra-religious schools from teaching the core curriculum. So basically, the petitioners here claimed that it's not constitutional to exempt these schools because it violates the right to education of the Haredi school students. The third one is more recent. It's about ultra-religious women who are insisting on being part of the candidates for the Knesset of a Haredic political party. And the problem is that Haredic political parties in Israel do not include women in their candidacy list. Women cannot be a member of Haredi political party, and therefore she cannot apply for being included in the party list of candidates. So I'll do it very fast because I don't have time. But in the case of the Sharia court, what happened was that it was very clear that there are some approaches within Sharia law that accept the idea that women can actually serve as arbitrators in Sharia courts. It was very clear that the Sharia court in Taipei and the Sharia court of appeal above him chose those to select. Dafna, it's my small daughter. Dafna, אני לא יכולה עכשיו עוד 5 דקות. It was obvious that they chose the interpretation of the Sharia law that the Sharia court chose the interpretation of the Sharia law that does not go in accordance with women being an arbitrator. So in the second one, as I said, some of the petitioners were actually ex-ultra-Orthodox Haredi. So they were once ultra-Orthodox and then they become some version of secular. They wanted to go to universities in Israel, and then the university says to them, well, you don't have an education in math or English, you cannot enroll to this institution, you have a problem. And then they file a petition and claim that the laws that actually exempted their school from having the core curriculum is not constitutional because it violates the right to education, the right to autonomy. It didn't allow them these days to be autonomous, to have jobs, to be enrolled to university. The case of the women who wanted to be represented at the political party, at Haredi political party, was pushing the right to equality. Here again, the Israel High Court of Justice accepted their petition and actually forced the Haredi political party to remove the exclusion of women from the participation in the party. I have to say that it was not a very effective remedy, because although the Supreme Court did it, the Haredi political party, it is called Yadut Torah, they didn't elect any women in their list of candidates. But in any case, I want to go to the arguments. The idea was that the legal terms that were put through all these cases were not about religious freedom. And that's what I find very frustrating, because each of them could have articulated their claim in terms of religious freedom. Because if we're talking about, I mean, it depends on your conception of religious freedom, but my conception of religious freedom is about a culture that is shared by many people. It cannot be dominated only by the majority within the minority group. And if we adhere to this, I guess, liberal concept of religious freedom, then I think we should also, I think that these minorities within minorities missed articulating their claims in terms of religious freedom. What will they gain from it? Why is it better? I think that when the law recognizes the right to religious freedom in its collective dimension, it gives more power to minority members within minority groups. It gives them more power to articulate how they see, how they perceive their version of the religion they adhere to and identify with. And when they stress that they are vulnerable minorities within a religious minority community, I think that it makes their claim much stronger. So that's the main argument. I'm sorry that I didn't provide a paper. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting themes, actually. And of course, we hope that you can find time to make your paper that it can be included. So this very interesting theme, which he actually touches on some themes that are covered in the dissertation of Dennis Petrie. So Dennis, I think it would be nice if you can give your comment and be the final speaker this afternoon, actually. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Govert. So I'll try really to be brief, so not to keep you longer than necessary. The reason why I volunteered to be discussed for this paper is actually because even though the authors did not have the opportunity to submit their paper yet, I'm actually quite familiar with Maytal Pinto's work. And actually, she has inspired me tremendously while working on my own dissertation on the specific vulnerability of religious minorities. And I just would like to highlight a few points that I think are very important. First, of course, the presentation and the topic highlights once again, and there's a number of other papers that we discussed today that touch upon that same topic, and that's the consequences, the policy consequences, or in this case the legal judicial consequences of the ignorance about religious freedom or religion or persecution. And so I would actually like to add to the concept of religious illiteracy, there's also religious freedom illiteracy. And I think that that's a very important point. And it's also an illustration of something Jonathan Fox started with, of the multiple understandings, interpretations of religious freedom that exist. Because of course, the petitioners in these cases understand religious freedom differently than their own religious group, because they're a minority within a larger religious group. And they have different interpretations of religious freedom, which I think is very important to take into account. Overall, the application of minorities within the minorities, applying that concept to the analysis of religious freedom is I think, essential, because it really allows to uncover a blind spot in religious freedom research, because religious freedom research in general looks very little at these kind of cases, like the 3 Israeli cases that were presented, and that's because I believe that most frameworks to analyze religious freedom do not take into account precisely minority within the minority kind of cases. So it's a concept that's useful to understand religious freedom violations, but it's also a concept that's useful to inform inform public policy and inform, in this case, a legal action of vulnerable minorities. In my own research, I did one case study on the vulnerability of converts to Christianity within the Nasa tribe in Colombia. Actually, I was very happy that I found this concept of minority within the minority, because it really gave me the tools to interpret that case. Because most analysis that I found on the NASA situation were about protecting this minority, this indigenous group that has been under pressure since colonial times. But really little is done and understood of what happens to minorities within that indigenous minority group, the minority within the minority, and in this case, religious converts within this minority group. But it could also apply to sexual minorities or gender minorities or other kinds of minorities within that group. And so I think this concept is just very, very important also to shed light on what I call intra-ethnic conflicts, whereas most scholarships tend to look at inter-ethnic conflicts. So conflicts between different ethnic groups, or between an ethnic group and the state, or between an ethnic group and a multinational, in environmental cases, for example, but very little attention is given to what happens inside an ethnic group. And so I think—
Can you wrap up, Dennis?
Sure, yeah. Just connected with this, I think very important, and I'll probably talk more about that next week when I present my own paper, but the concept of vulnerability in this kind of cases is probably more useful than the concept of persecution. And I also think that we should look at minorities in many different ways, and not only just looking at religious identity, because if you only look at religious identity, then even those cases that you mentioned in Israel are not taken into consideration. So, and then I know in your work you're looking at other cases also, Canada. I've worked on Colombia, Israel. Just bring the third case you mentioned also brings to mind a Dutch case of a Dutch Orthodox Protestant political party who also did not allow women to be members. And again, they were forced to accept women, and from the standpoint of the rights of women, this was obviously a positive thing. But from the standpoint of religious freedom, well, that part, of course, needs to be discussed and balanced as well. So anyway, I'll leave it here. But yeah, thank you for inspiring me, and look forward to your final paper.
Dennis, thank you very much. I didn't know about this Dutch case. Wow, it will be in the paper for sure.
Yeah,
and thank you for your comments.
Yeah, that's a real similar case. I was thinking about it too. So that's sure we can give you the details on that. So yeah,
Great.
yeah. Okay. Well, people, congratulations all with your perseverance. Actually, for 3 hours, more than 3 hours, that we have here convened in a digital way, which is. As all people say of the experience of many people and my own experience too, is rather tiring. So I think you did very well. So thank you very much. We dealt with 9 of the 14 papers. Next week we have 5 left. So well, for those of you who can make it, we really hope to meet you again then next week at 3 o'clock Amsterdam time. And others, well, who cannot make it and are still have to finish their papers or in the next the second draft. Well, we wish you all the best, and well, we hope to see each other again next week. Bye bye.
Hi, thank you very much. I'll send out an email with specific instructions for the next meeting. And please remember, all the others that are not part of the authors of this special issue, remember to just drop your email into the chat so we can also invite you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.